models that violate privacy and autonomy of individuals as well as communities. And we also need to reject like data business models, such as the dominant social media model that profiteers from the viral circulation of misogyny and misinformation. At the same time, an economic democracy at the global level also presupposes the jurisdictional sovereignty of nation states to formulate appropriate national digital policies for women's empowerment. This is vital not only to curtail data extractivism by corporations, but also to ensure equitable distribution of the benefits of data-based innovations in an international development order. To go a little bit more quickly on the other aspects, we need an equitable and fair trade regime that rejects hyper liberalization of digital trade, right? We should reject the whole hype about like, just liberalize e-commerce and everything will be okay and look past it. Secondly, we need to ensure that at the global level, we have a progressive taxation regime that ensures developing country governments do not lose the valuable tax revenue they need for social care infrastructure investments in the digital economy. So we need to find an effective way to tax big tech. And this means we need to think of how do you value data flows and how do you start taxing the data flows economy. Third, South-South cooperation in leveraging AI for development. As we know that the market-based paradigm of North-South technology transfer and building data and AI capacities in the developing countries, that has absolutely failed. And that's quite clear now. And finally, we need to be asking for universal labor guarantees in platform controlled value chains, as all work is becoming platform work these days, right? Next slide. The second prong that we had thought of was about big tech accountability for women's human rights. And I think many in this room are already familiar with this issue. So for a long time, there has been a talk and many organizations have been working towards this on a binding treaty on transnational corporations. And this becomes even more salient and important in the context of the intelligent digital corporation, right? The second point is, these days we hear a lot of thought about how do you overcome gender bias in the design and development of data and AI technology. And here I would like to mention that in the group, we believe mere self-governance is not enough. We also need binding industry standards to hold transnational digital corporations to account. Coming to the next slide. So the third prong was about looking at feminist digital infrastructure policies. So on the one hand, on the left, the diagram you can see is about asking for a connectivity plus approach, because more and more it's becoming evident that the mantra that give access to women and they will empower themselves and they will access economic opportunities, that is clearly not working, because the dominant platform model does not like work for the medium, small or micro enterprises. So there needs to be a new conversation on having public platform marketplaces and encouraging women's enterprises from a cooperativist and solidarity economy tradition, helping them build their digital capabilities, participation in these platform marketplaces. There's a lot of work to be done here, so that beyond the spiel of just like, open up like the e-commerce market and women can empower themselves, that can't really happen. And then finally, coming to the point of like public data pool and cloud intelligence infrastructure, where you can see the diagram on the right. What do we mean by this? This sounds like a lot of jargon, right? I'll just try to explain with a couple of examples. For instance, a national tech accelerator policy could catalyze linkages between a women farmers group and a women-led tech startup to launch a new smart farming initiative. Using public cloud intelligence services, tech startup could provide analytics and insights to the farmers group, or you could think of AI innovations in the public sector, health, energy, transportation, etc., which can enable cost-effective public provisioning of services on scale with positive impacts for women's social and economic empowerment. Next slide. So here I pause with a quote from Silvia Federici, and just to paraphrase or adapt that to our struggle, it's evident that the struggle against digital capitalism has to be a collective ongoing effort, and this is not possible without cross-movement conversations, right? So when we came out with this feminist action framework in the group, the intent or the idea was for this document to be a trigger or catalyst for these very important conversations that we need to have. And each of these images can be used as a conversation starter in their own right. Next slide. So to keep the conversation alive, like how would one potentially use these various visual aids and everything? I'll just give you a couple of quick examples in 5 or 10 seconds. Just go down. Next slide. So, for instance, there is this diagram, right, about a new multilateralism for development in the digital age. If there's a gathering of feminist activists with people from the tax justice and also from the trade justice community, one could think of solutions beyond these 4 or 5 things just put out there, and this could be a conversation starter. Next slide. And also here, like, we are thinking about the woman sailing on the digital economy and the three-pronged roadmap. As I mentioned at the start or middle of the presentation, we have talked about 3 prongs. I'm sure there are numerous more. And I think the whole point is to widen this conversation because the time to act is now. And I come to my final slide. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to say that, I want to thank on behalf of Anita Gurumurthy and myself and the team at IT for Change, each and every one of the working group members and the FAS team, because this journey over a year has been a great learning experience. And it has been fantastic working on this issue with all of you. And I hope that we continue to keep the conversations alive and widen this community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anita. It was quite a challenging task to bring all of this into a short presentation. And just wanted to say that we would share the link to the full framework document in the chat box. Also, a link to our project website where you can find all the illustrations that were part of Nandini's presentation just now. And I would like to encourage you, in case some questions came up now during Nandini's presentation, to please put them in the Q&A box. We will collect them and ask them later. I'm very happy that as Nandini's slide ended with the names of the different working group members who have all been part of this project, that actually 2 of them were able to join us today. So I have with me Anna Tuvera, and I have with me Sofia Scacera. And I want to invite both of them to reflect a little bit further on the issues that were raised in the presentation by Nandini. And Anna, maybe we can start with you. Anna is based in Singapore, where she is the Director of Gender Equality Activities at ITUC Asia Pacific. And Anna, I wanted to check with you, when we look at the Asia region, what do you think are critical issues of concern for feminist action in the digital economy, and especially from the standpoint of women workers in platform-controlled value chains? What are some key signals also from within the trade union movement that we need to be alert to, both in terms of challenges, but also future hopes? Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. I may not be able to provide answers to those 3 very important questions, but I'll try my best within the 7-minute intervention to give you some ideas. We join you at this important launch with a new sense of optimism and excitement that the deal we always wanted. It's not just a manifesto, but our pledge, and the pledge that we want to see relevant institutions are taking as well, and working towards becoming a reality. This framework came at the perfect time. I wish we could have worked on this exciting piece sooner, but it was definitely worth the wait. Thank you, FES, and the amazing Anita Nandini of IT for Change, and members of the working group for initiating this essential work and for allowing us to be part of it. I still remember in 2015 when the ILO embarked on a 4-year journey called Future of Work Initiative that began with a series of national dialogues. At that time, our own ITUC Asia Pacific governing body adopted a resolution enjoining our members to ensure women's participation in the planning, implementation of future work dialogues at all levels and more. Because that was precisely what has been and regrettably continues to this very day, exclusion of women, their aspirations, their voices in many spaces, and decisions that could potentially affect their future and that of their families. And yes, we needed the resolution to make sure that they are not left behind, at least within our ranks. It was a formidable challenge, bringing us closer to the future of world of work we had hoped for and wanted, but it's not impossible. I am optimistic because actions and initiatives across movements in the region contribute to making the promise of a gender equal and just society and digital economy real for all of us. We know now how to restart this critical conversation with this framework and make sure that our shared aspirations are held, supported, and heeded. Because there are many opportunities to do exactly that and to do more. Allow me to highlight 2 points here. First one, a Senate inquiry in Australia was established last Thursday to look into gaps in existing workplace laws and the impact of insecure or precarious employment on the economy, wages, social cohesion, workplace rights, and conditions. The inquiry will focus on businesses across various sectors that sought to utilize a gig or on-demand economy structure, including the heavily feminized aged care. Second, while the pandemic may have made it more difficult for workers to organize and fight for better working conditions, it has also shone a light on their daily struggles and inspired a greater sense of solidarity, particularly with and amongst workers in the gig, platform, or on-demand economy. For example, unions in countries like Indonesia, Singapore, Australia, Korea, just to name a few, have been organizing gig platform or atypical workers and raising their collective voices for an effective regulatory framework and robust standards for platform work and practice in addressing insecure work more generally. These two things, along with our engagements in the binding treaty process to end corporate impunity, in implementing the ILO Centenary Declaration on the Future of Work, which guarantees all workers a labor protection floor, including the rights to union membership and collective bargaining, maximum limits on working hours, adequate minimum wages, and health and safety protection, are more than enough to make us, the youth trade union movement, PC with many intriguing leads for the follow-up. We specifically look up to our team of union women and young people and their leadership in driving and shaping the deal we always wanted, which is a new social contract grounded on sustainability, inclusiveness, decent work, human, and labor rights. But for now, we have a crucial task ahead of our team to create a deeper awareness of the framework and what this means for our work on 4 fronts. First, on building women's leadership. Second, on women's organizing. Third, on removing barriers to women's economic empowerment. And finally, addressing the impact of interacting in multiple forms of discrimination. With the last 2 points stressed, we're excited to work with you as we continue to push the boundaries of what is possible beyond this virtual space to progress more concrete actions on the ground and to do so collectively. Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you so much, Anna. And thank you also for this being a more optimistic look on things. That is very nice and good to hear. I would like to ask Sophia to join us now. And maybe the question is more or less the same that I posed to Anna, but of course, Sophia, we would be really interested to hear more about the Latin American region. And when you look at the similar, when you look at the question that I asked Anna on the critical issues of concern for feminists in the digital economy. Can you confirm this optimistic outlook that Anna just mentioned, or how is it different in terms in your region, basically? Thank you.
Bueno, Natalia, muchas gracias a todos por estar acá en este enorme trabajo colectivo que hemos hecho para poner este manifiesto feminista en la economía digital. La realidad es que la región en América Latina resistió la embestida neoliberal, resistió el neoliberalismo durante muchísimos años. En los últimos tiempos, ya con el gobierno de Bolsonaro y con gobiernos neoliberales que fueron progresivamente tomando la región, vimos una especie de somnolencia en muchos grupos sociales, pero el feminismo no se rindió. El feminismo fue la gran bandera que logró seguir adelante con las demandas sociales cuando todo parecía perdido, cuando el neoliberalismo parecía ganarnos. En este sentido, las mujeres estaban organizadas, estaban movilizadas, reclamando por distintos reclamos sociales como el cese de la violencia machista, el cese de la violencia sobre nuestros cuerpos, peleando por la ley de aborto y peleando por tantos otros derechos y causas feministas más. Mientras tanto, la economía digital siguió creciendo y el extractivismo digital de las empresas, las grandes empresas transnacionales, siguió adelante, llevando adelante lo que Nadini muy bien decía, que era esta datificación de nuestros cuerpos y de nuestras vidas, transformando a nuestros cuerpos, a nuestras relaciones sociales y a nuestras vidas en general en un producto para consumo a través de los datos y a través de la economía digital. Esto no se puso en la vanguardia de los debates feministas y el feminismo no supo entender cuál era el problema que estaba siendo llevado adelante por la economía digital, pero poco a poco veo que cada vez más el movimiento feminista comienza a comprender la importancia de pelear por una economía digital más feminista, porque es la única manera de empezar a entender a los datos como bienes comunes, como bienes públicos, y empezar a entender la economía digital con una lógica no extractivista y no capitalista. Estos objetivos son fundamentales, sobre todo en América Latina, porque en América Latina nosotros supimos tener una lógica no capitalista que fue destruida con la conquista de América Latina por parte de los españoles y por parte de los europeos. Nosotros entendíamos la economía con un fin ecológico y humano. Los incas, los mayas, los aztecas, eran todas colonias, eran todos pueblos que entendían a la economía como único fin la sostenibilidad de la vida. Cuando el capitalismo llega, nos arrancan esa cultura, ese objetivo, y el objetivo empieza a ser el afán de lucro. El lucro por el lucro mismo. Y en este sentido, la datificación de nuestros cuerpos y de nuestras vidas continúa con esta lógica de lucro que hace que no podamos detenernos a mirar el daño que le estamos haciendo a la humanidad, al mundo y a nuestros cuerpos y al mundo entero, ¿no? A la ecología. El movimiento feminista en América Latina tuvo una particularidad en los últimos años, que es que en el sentido de las cadenas de valor de las plataformas, se puso a la vanguardia de las demandas de los derechos laborales. Vemos que las mujeres son las que organizaron la economía de plataformas en Argentina, en Ecuador, en Colombia, y hoy lo están haciendo en Brasil. Son las mujeres las que empezaron los sindicatos de plataformas. Son las mujeres las que empezaron a entender la problemática del extractivismo a través de apps menstruales. Son las mujeres las que empezaron a hablar sobre sesgo algorítmico en América Latina y sobre cómo nos impactan los algoritmos en nuestras vidas. Son las mujeres las que empezaron a reclamar derechos en torno al teletrabajo cuando la pandemia nos arrojó de una manera impresionante al teletrabajo, provocando que la vida privada y la vida pública se fusionen y tengamos que cuidar y maternar a nuestros hijos, pero a la vez también trabajar para nuestros empleadores, en nuestras casas. La violencia machista se vio mucho más exacerbada con las mujeres metidas adentro del hogar, donde tuvimos muchísima cantidad de femicidios, muchos más que en otros momentos históricos. Entonces las mujeres somos las que estamos empezando a debatir tecnología. Somos aquellas que estamos empezando a disputar el poder tecnológico en la región. Y somos aquellas que estamos empezando a organizarnos a través de redes de programadoras, cooperativas de programadores y mujeres en tecnología y en STEM para poder hacer una resistencia digital a un corporativismo despiadado que lo único que quiere es comercializar, datificando nuestra propia existencia. En este sentido veo muchísima esperanza en la región, veo muchísima esperanza en este manifiesto digital que hemos armado con la FES, porque necesitamos una hoja de ruta para poder seguir adelante con las conquistas. Necesitamos una vía que nos diga cómo poder seguir, cuáles son los horizontes para poder tejer alianzas a nivel global más allá de la lucha latinoamericana y colectiva y feminista que estamos teniendo. Así que celebro mucho este manifiesto, espero que les sirva, espero que lo lean y espero que entre todas podamos tejer esta alianza feminista global para poder hacer frente al extractivismo digital, a la manera despiadada en la que se llevan la materia prima digital para poder generar ingresos en 2 países nada más, a expensas de todo el sur global que sigue sumergido en la pobreza extrema. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you so much. It's very heartening to hear about the feminist movements in Latin America and how they have been demanding their rights very strongly, and also that they understand the importance of understanding how the digital economy works and what the impacts are on women's lives. So thank you to both of you, you and Anna. And I would now like to invite our 2 discussants who are joining us today. I think both of them don't really need an introduction. I'm very, very happy and honored that Geeta Zen and Mariama Williams are here with us. Just a few sentences. I mean, most of you know, Geeta is the general coordinator of DAWN, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. And she has worked on gender equality and women's human rights for over 30 years. And Mariama Williams, who is the coordinator for sustainable development, climate change, and gender programs at the South Center. I'm very happy you're here with us today. I think in many ways, this conversation about the deal we always wanted, it links back to the challenges that feminists have always warned about in the context of capitalist globalization and also its exploitation, of the spheres of both production and social reproduction. So building on your insights and building on your learnings from your long experience of leading global struggles against the deep-rooted neoliberal economics, it would be really interesting to hear, or if you could reflect on what you think is unique or new to the current moment. And maybe I could invite Geeta first also to maybe look at more specifically how we can reboot the feminist social contract in this digital moment. And of course, we'd also be happy to hear if there's any comments you would have on the framework document itself. Geeta.
Thanks very much, Natalia, and hello, everybody. I see old friends and hopefully some new ones. It's great to be here. And it's great to be part of this very, very important discussion. So I want to congratulate FES and of course the working group and Nandini and Anita and IT for Change for the great work that you are doing in this area. I'm going to, your question is very apt because that was in fact something that reading the document itself brought to my mind. And I'm going to start off with a proposition and then open up to a couple of broad sets of questions and issues. They are related to the paper, but they, I think, go sort of step outside the paper's boundaries. The comment that I want to start with is simply this, that the central impact of any social economic change on gender is almost always through the way in which it reduces or affects public space and public governance. And the reason for this is because of the sphere of reproduction. Reproduction is something that capitalism is not particularly interested in. It's something that sort of sits on the margins. It survives if the state supports it through a variety of different mechanisms. And it falls by the wayside and largely falls onto the heads of women if the state doesn't support it. And of course, we know very well, even if the state provides some kind of partial support, ultimately the care economy, the survival of human beings, the economy of life, as people have started calling it now, very much is women's responsibility. So it's impossible for that reason, not because of some essentialism given by the fact that we are women, but by our responsibility for reproduction and care, that we are sort of joined at the hip to what happens to the public space and to public governance as well. Having said this, and in a sense, I think the framework paper and clearly the discussions that have gone on behind it in the context of the working group have addressed, in a sense, articulated different elements of this. Let me move on then to a first set of questions, which is one that I've been trying to come to grips with in the context of the relationship between neoliberal economics, or the neoliberal development paradigm, as the paper calls it, and the digital or data economy. I think this is not obvious, and it's not obvious to a lot of people. It wasn't that long ago, I would say probably not more than about 10 years or less, when we were linking, when we thought about neoliberal economics, we largely used to speak about financialization and the interactions or contradictions between the financialized economy and the real economy. And now somewhere into that picture has come this whole business of the digital economy or the data economy. And I think it's very important that we understand the links and connections between these three, because they're not so straightforward and not so obvious. Let me just quickly go through 5 or 6 things which I think are critical elements of neoliberal economies. First, global versus national production, distribution, and consumption. Second, financialization. Third, policy agendas that support globalization, namely through open borders for trade and financial flows, support for global tax regimes, including tax shelters, and so on. Fourth, Bretton Woods institutions working through the IMF as global governance mechanisms that ensure fiscal discipline in support of free financial flows, inflation control over tackling unemployment. Fifth, the Bretton Woods institutions working this time through the World Bank that advance deregulation of labor and other markets, privatization and public-private partnerships, and the debasing of environmental, health, education, and other standards. Sixth, the WTO, increasingly replaced or supplanted by regional trade agreements that reduce domestic policy space. And all of these together, the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, as disciplining mechanisms for finance, for the real economy, and for commerce and investment. So what's the connection between all of this that we understand as neoliberal economics and the digital economy? And I think the paper has pointed to a number of ways in which one can see the connections. Initially, the digital economy basically came in as technological support for financialization, but increasingly in production, CAD, CAM, computer-aided design, robotics, and increasingly artificial intelligence, and then in distribution and consumption as well. It also came in by taking advantage of the emerging neoliberal policy regimes for finance, for trade, for taxation and deregulation. And then increasingly, the digital or data economy has become the platform for more and more inroads into production, distribution, and consumption. In a sense, one could say that Wall Street and Silicon Valley have mutual and interlocking interests. But it's very important for us to understand the way in which this has happened and what remains and why it is that we can talk, but we must talk distinctly of financialization, the real economy, and the ways in which the digital economy interpenetrates both of those. Now, how is all of this gendered? And I think the paper tells us it's through rising inequality, through deregulated labor, through a primitive accumulation of resources and extractivism, including, and in Dawn, we've been doing a fair bit of work recently on the blue economy, which is the way in which deep sea mining for the requirements of the digital economy are in fact the latest in the extractivist model. Secondly, it's gendered through fiscal discipline and shrinking national policy space. And thirdly, for such things as care, as social protection. And thirdly, it's through shrinking multilateral policy space for advancing human rights, fair trade, fair taxation, and global governance. What does all this mean in terms of where we go and where we go, how we take this forward? I think the paper has put forward a range of key elements of a gender-just economy. But I do think that we need to ask the question, what is it that we can do that we are not already doing? Because in a sense, we are there in the trade debates and challenges on tax justice, on funding for women, on increasingly on in-platform workers. We're talking about accountability for women's human rights. Increasingly, we are talking about inclusion, including digital infrastructure. So what is it more that we can do that, that we're not already doing? I think one of the things is very importantly what this particular approach is doing, which is informing and showing feminist and women's organizations and others the links between neoliberalism, financialization, and the data economy. Secondly, we need to find the chinks. It's not enough to show the links, and it's not enough to repeat the agendas that we're already working on. Where are the contradictions? Where are the chinks? Where, for example, is the culture of Wall Street different from the culture of Silicon Valley? We know that they are different. And you can see this, for instance, in the most recent thing that we've all been concerned about, which is the US elections. Wall Street and Silicon Valley were or appeared to be coming from very different cultural positions, except when they colluded with each other. And we need to see where the chinks in this, where the contradictions between these need to be. And thirdly, and this is my final point, we need to see what kinds of South-North coalitions can happen. It can't happen only through South-South coalitions. And the reason for this is, for instance, the breakup of big tech requires South-North coalitions. And I'll say this, and I'll give you one quick example to say why I think this is crucial. I was just listening earlier today to a podcast. It's an American podcast of 4 young progressive guys who are very concerned with pushing the Biden administration towards a far more progressive agenda on all fronts. But they were talking about the vaccines. And their talk about the vaccines was about how the Trump administration had let pass the possibility of acquiring even more of the globally available vaccines for Americans. And I kept listening to this and thinking, guys, which world are you living in? There's a world outside America that needs vaccines far more than the very large amount that you've already cornered. And this is the way in which progressives in the US are talking about COVID and COVID vaccines. It shows us, I think, what a huge task lies ahead of us in terms of seeing what the South-North coalition building possibilities in this data-fied, globalized, financialized world need to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta. Thank you very much. This was a lot of food for thought for us as well, especially since, of course, for us, this framework document is not to be an end in itself, but it is something that we want to continue to work with. And I think you raised a lot of really good points and questions that all link into this. So thank you very much. I'm just looking at the time a little bit. So we still have a little bit over half an hour. And I would now like to ask Mariama to join us. And Mariama, as I told you, the questions that or your intervention is more or less around the same angle that I asked Geeta. But in particular, for you, I wanted to check if we could, because Nandini in her presentation also mentioned a new multilateralism. So the global multilateral system is under threat, it's not working, is being criticized. So a more specific question to you would also be, how can we revive the global multilateral system so that it can effectively address digital injustices? Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for invitation to participate in this very important discussion. And I like the feminist futures or feminist future. It's very difficult, as always, to follow Gita. So, but I will try my best. I think first I would like to flag somewhere I think a lot of the features and characteristics of what digitalization is, our digital economy is, relevant to the kinds of discussions we've had over the last 20, 30 years. I think for sure, for certainly, it is very clear and that the exacerbation of inequality, the deepening of feminization of power, these are very, very common and very repeated patterns that feminists have been engaged with for a very long time. I think the discussion has morphed into issues around global value chains and extractivism, but still underlying them are fundamental issues around international division of labor, gender division of labor, the exploitation of the social economy, social reproduction, gift economy, and all of those things are still what's underlying our new orientation around digital economy. So I think many of the fundamental questions are still there. I mean, we used to talk a lot about horizontal and vertical integration of corporations that produce goods and services and how that is utilized to disempower workers, both in the North and in the South. And that still seems to be a running thread through this whole digitalization and digital justice. So all of the justices, we talk about economic justice, climate justice, they all come around these central points around the operations of capital and how they privilege one group who may be first starters or even those who have access to the control of resources from bottom to top, cross and lengthwise. And I think so. I think those enduring features, they seemingly are enduring features, still exist. And so we need to start by recognizing that. I think the other dimension is that we are in a climate constrained world. And the question is to what extent this digital economy, digital e-commerce gives us any foothold, any grasp of dealing with the trajectory of the fact that after 30 years of international negotiations, we have not managed to bend the emissions curve. And there used to be a certain amount of rigidity that people talk about, that capital would not be able to do this, government could not do this. But we do see that under COVID, we see the speed, in some cases lightning speed with which governments have reacted, and even business have reacted to take advantage, to retool production, to take advantage of new markets. We see airlines suddenly are retooling their entire fleet to deliver vaccines, to deliver masks and certain other things. But we haven't seen that kind of action around the fact that we have tipping global points that will drown, starve, and kill millions and millions of people in developing countries, particularly in the SIDS and LDCs. So I think there's a certain amount of some things have changed, but somehow remain the same. In regards to multilateralism, I have been puzzling that. In fact, I'm doing a small paper on it at the moment. And the question is, do we want to reform multilateralism or do we want to transform it? Because reform it or re-engage it to do what and for what purpose? We have a lot of tension. You see it in the various spheres of global negotiation. In the WTO, in the multilateral trade system, the big pressure about graduating developing countries. In climate, we talk about eliminating walls between Annex 1 and Annex 2. We talk about the new world, it's a new world. And in digitalization, again, the whole digitalization story is being sold that we need to have digitalization. We need to have agreement on e-commerce in the WTO. For why? For eradicating poverty, for women's empowerment. And so these arguments get recycled by the proponents And you see it, we've seen it from structural adjustment, we've seen it from the whole discussion about moving the World Bank and the IMF. So we are in an era where the multilateral system from any point, whether it's the financial or trade system, is under significant pressure. We shifted, once we got into this, supposedly once we shifted from the American dominated to now a more multipolar world, we thought that we would have some semblance of inequality, but the same framework dominates. We still have the Bretton Woods system, they dominate. They are dominating in climate finance, even though that's a whole new financial apparatus. And despite the fact that we talk about making finance compatible with climate resilience and the climate change goal, the idea is to help manage the risk of the financial sector, the risk of the corporate sector, not the risk of the people on the ground who are suffering and who have to bear the brunt of the losses and damage of climate change. So I think that we are in no way, we don't have anywhere either a set of technocratic group of thinkers and agitators who are controlling any dominant institutions. What it has been very good at doing is incorporating our countries. So we went from the G3 to the G5, G7, and now we have the G20. But the policies of the G20 doesn't look any different from the policies of the G7. And in many cases within the G20, the other 12 or 8 countries do not speak. And they do not have strong positions. So it's still dominated. So we have a sense of a pluralism, but the entities remain the same as they were prior to the financial crisis in many cases. So I think the new multilateralism then really is about how do we generate non-state actors, right? Such as, and here we have to be cautious because non-state actors also include corporations and they also include international NGOs. But what we want is we want community and local CSOs to be enlivened, to have the tools of understanding what's going on. And this is where the book does, the monograph, the publication, I think, does a very good job of opening up this black box of what is digital economy, what is digital justice, which is something quite mystifying to many of us who do not work in that area and do not follow the day-to-day nuances of it. Right? In Geneva and in Paris, we see that one aspect of the new multilateral framework is at the OECD, where they're negotiating the so-called inclusive framework. Again, another takeover of terminology that we as feminists have talked about. We've talked about diversity, inclusion. So the OECD is talking about the inclusive framework for taxing the digital economy. And that is a whole area of changing taxing rights that's not been touched for the last 30 years to look at how do governments have access to the digital economy. And the inclusive framework came around because for a very good reason that developed countries under the G24 put forward pretty radical positions for those governments about how to tax the digital economy, because the traditional taxation was based on physical presence. And of course, the digital economy is not it's not grounded in physical presence. So G24 had put forward a proposal about how to do that. And then the developed countries, of course, had their own proposals. So the OECD stepped into what is a political discussion and came up with this idea of a 2-pillar approach and an alternative inclusive framework to taxing the digital economy, which is still grounded in the OECD membership, right? And I think that's something that we need to look at, some of this area of allocation of taxation of rights, because as we can see from COVID, the firms who have done the best and are striving greatly are the digital firms. But many of our countries do not have laws on the book or legislations on the book about how to tax the digital economy. And so that's an area of work. I see that one of the lens that is proposed is progressive taxation. Well, progressive taxation is not what we thought it would be. in digital economy. It's not simply about simplifying taxing, it's really radically altering the foundation of allocating taxation rights when there is no physical presence. And that requires serious rethinking that are fundamental. And so we need to unpack this progressive taxation discussion, because it's not, again, simply about leveraging tax, breaking up tax codes and so forth. It's about looking at the new forms in which capital is presenting itself and avoiding taxation or any responsibility. So that's something I think we need to unpack, the progressive taxation plank that I saw there. Definitely to unpack that. I think we need to look at the IFIs, and I think it goes way beyond participation, which is part of the gender discussion sometimes we have about participation. It goes way beyond the participation of opening up the IMF or the World Bank to have more developing countries on the board. It goes back to really changing what it is that we're looking at in the economy, what is development about, what is sustainable development about, and we can actually ground ourselves within some of the SDG framework, though they're very narrow in many respects, but they speak to the fundamental things that impacts the lives of men and women on the ground. And how does the digital economy, e-commerce, which is what's negotiated here in Geneva, or this two-pillar framework, impact on the digital economy? Of course, there's the dimensions that Gita has flagged, which is about the impact of the digital economy, Facebook, any of those, on democracy. And I think in many ways, the whole notion of democracy itself needs to be unpacked. We've seen, and maybe one of the only good point about Trump is that he's actually opened up this mystification about democracy and who has it and how it works and where it works and doesn't work and how it really functions. And so I think we need to question some of these base assumptions and not use some of those words which constrain our capacity to organize and link us to kind of old modes of thinking. So I think the feminist agenda is still pretty much the solid thing on the ground. And I think we are grounded in it. We're grounded in looking at the intersectionality of what's happening to women and men and children of different ability, different races, all of the various topics that are now part of the dynamics of what we have. The last 20 years, so we opened up the century with 9/11 and we're closing it with the pandemic. Well, we're entering on another, not a century, sorry, a 20-year cycle. So we're now beginning to enter on another 20-year cycle. And what are we beginning to put in place? How do we deal with questions? Do we still talk about feminization of poverty in the way that we talked about it in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s? How do we deal with inequality generated by digitalization, which is merging with extractivism and digitalization? As I remember in another IT panel earlier this year, we talked about the impact of digitalization on food, right? On commodities. So it's not a dematerialization. Digitalization have serious impact on food security and all of the various things that are fundamental to how we live. And so I think part of that and the contribution here is a demystification of it to show that it doesn't mean, it's not a neutral, clean sounded economy that, just really nice and pure, but actually there's a lot of dirt and mud and a lot of things that are crippling people's lives everywhere. I think one of the interesting thing I read in the Financial Times, I think was this weekend, was that the cocoa growers in Africa are trying to organize to get more of the value of cocoa, and they wanted to put a levy on cocos. And many of the same firms who have sustainable division and are talking about poverty eradication and gender, immediately, instead to try to put pressure and to break up this cartel, quote unquote cartel, I've gone into the futures market to buy cocoa, circumventing buying cocoa from local producers. Now they're able to do that again because of digitalization. So we have to look, it's not just, circumventing the idea of, one country, one person, one man vote in the US. It's also what it's doing and how it's used to manipulate what governments who may even try to think about utilizing, getting more of their revenues, which is reminiscent to me of the 1970s and 80s in Jamaica, when the Jamaican government under Michael Manley tried to put a levy on the bauxite industry to get a little bit more money for the Jamaican economy. And the bauxite industry reacted similar way, not using high tech. Then they used low tech. We had capital flight. We had the US government pressuring the local elite, and they together, were able to circumvent many of that. As you said, the same thing. We're 2020, December 2020. And here we have dirt poor farmers in African countries trying to get more for the coffee. And two of these countries are 60% of the global cocoa. Chocolate bar sells in Switzerland at beaucoup prices, and Switzerland doesn't grow any cocoa. And again, the capital very cleanly, very nicely, with a touch of a button, is able to thwart that possibility. So I think we have to do a little bit more of what Gita was saying, nuancing some of what are the distinctiveness and the distinctions, and how are they used to disempower people, and how we can exploit fissures and cracks, because that's kind of what we're left with right now. And unfortunately, unlike the 70s, well, maybe not, we don't have a lot of our governments who even have the vision, much less. Many of our governments, certainly I could talk for mine, are technocratic. They've learned the wrong lesson from the 1970s and 80s, and their whole goal is to make them look good for credit, because and that desperation to look good to attract cheap credit is putting us in more dangers, because that means they're going to be willing to accept foreign direct investment at all costs, ignoring the last 10 years where many of them have been fighting for eliminating investor state dispute settlement provisions in trade agreement. Now they will be accepting all of these things, thwarting many of the work that's been done by people who are pushing for responsible investing. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I kudos for doing this. I have learned a lot, because I don't follow the nitty-gritty of how digitalization work and what digital justice means, and how it links to economic justice, gender justice, and climate justice. But having read that, now I can begin to start, and I'm not yet anywhere at the end of processing this, putting that together as we think about what do we mean by multilateralism, and who is it for, and what will it do, and what kind of framework of intergovernmental coordination do we need to promote the kinds of results that are articulated in under the seizing the moment discussion in the book. And I think we see that just like the governments right now, we are stuck, because they are stuck with moribund, and in some case, macroeconomic tools that they keep using and using, because there's nothing else that they can rely on, or that capital will trust. And in many ways, we still have the same articulation about what we want to do. We want to build cross movement. Well, that's what we were doing since the 1980s. Since I've been in this, we've been trying to build cross movement across feminists. We've been linking labor rights. We've been linking trade justice campaign and advocacy. We've been doing all of those things. So how do we sharpen those? How do we get those to be more dynamic, and to really hit like bullseye in what we want to do, utilizing the framework of digital economy, climate crisis, and all of the issues around the COVID. I think the inequality issues around COVID is going to be another area that we need to figure out how to deal with, because already pretty much all the developed countries have bought a purchase or issued purchase order for the vaccine. There's not one low income country, okay, that has issued one. They're all trying to go through COVAX and the vaccine facilities. But within our countries, we'll see that inequality play out in terms of access to a vaccine, and globally. So where does human rights, where does solidarity fit into all of these? So I think we're back to square one in many cases when we're at the beginning, in the high throes of structural adjustment, which destroyed a whole decade in Latin America and Africa. We're back to some of those issues right now, except we now have fancy terms like digitalization, digital justice, and all of those. But we're still back to those hard brick and mortar kind of discussions about how to help people live their day-to-day life, how to help them survive. How do governments get money to survive. We have $100 billion on the table for climate, and we don't have that $100 billion. OECD issued a report last 2 months ago, saying that we have $78 billion. Of course, thankfully, groups like Amnesty are saying, no, if you look at it, 40% of it is loans, and it's not 78 billion, and the developed countries have reinterpreted the agreement. The agreement says $100 billion per year by 2020. It didn't say $100 billion by 2020, but they have reinterpreted that. And we'll see a lot of this kind of skedaddling in this discussion around everything. Trade justice, climate justice, and vaccine. Yes, and I'm wrapping up. I'm done.
Okay, sorry. It's just thank you so much. I mean, there is so many thoughts that you have shared with us. I'm in particular interested if you could share at some point the paper you're working on multilateralism. That would be of real great interest to me. And because we have about 12 minutes only left, and I would like to give the chance to people to also ask questions. Currently, we've been going through the chat. There have actually been no questions, so I would like to propose the following. As you know, we have somebody doing graphic recording, so I would like maybe Kitty to ask to share her screen with us to see how she managed to capture all these rich points that were shared by the speakers. And in the meantime, I encourage you to please key in some questions into the chat box and also maybe who you're addressing them to. Thank you. Kitty, do you mind sharing your screen?
Hello, yes, I will share my screen. One second. I have a minor technical delay, but you can already start and I will share while you speak and continue.
Okay, there we go. Wow. Do you want to say a few words, Kitty, to this, or?
Yes, sure. So on the left side, I recorded the presentation of the Feminist Action Framework for the Digital Economy. As we also already could see, some of you maybe have seen on the publication, there's this metaphor of a surfer, basically, riding into the new era of maybe transforming digital economy in a social and sustainable way, against like reproducing, suppressing structures and also neoliberalist structures, which you can see here is like this octopus. So it's really about reclaiming the transformative potential of this transformation. And at the end, 3 pillars were highlighted out of which construct this framework. So new multilateralism for development in the digital age, big tech accountability for women's rights, and feminist digital infrastructure policies. Okay, exactly. And then on the right side, yes, all the different speakers gave some insights, for example, from Asian and Latin American perspective. Here, unions are raising their voices in Asia and new policies are on their way. And for Latin America, feminism is really a flag that has always been keeping on going. As Sophia said, and has been working against neoliberal structures, and feminist movements are really recognizing how the digital economy, which effect it has, and they're demanding the rights and going up to the streets. Yes, and the last two speakers, Gita and Mariama, have talked about many different issues. Gita highlighted the connection between digital economy, neoliberalism, neoliberal economics, and financialization, and that these links exist but haven't been paid too much attention. It's very important to inform others and show others, and think about where the contradictions and also especially form South-North coalitions. And Miriama talked about multilateralism and how do we include non-state players and also progressive taxation. And of course, how the pandemic has had the rise of digital businesses and yes, major topics can be seen in this development. Yes, this is it for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kitty. This looks great. It's amazing what you can do by putting these thoughts in actual visuals. I think it just breaks down what maybe looks as some dense information into, it's very nice to look at it this way. So thank you very much. We actually do have a question, and I'm looking at the watch. So we have about 5 minutes left only. So maybe let me read out the question, and it's directed to Mariama. The question is, or Mariama, I'm really empowered by your presentation, and my question to you, do we have a platform where we can report digital security injustices in the international media platform, where we can seek international legal advice on digital security issues, victims in underdeveloped nations? And I'd like, Mariama, if you could just try to be brief, so we can also give the other speakers some time to have some closing remarks. Thank you.
I could actually help you a lot because I don't know. I would think that IT for Change would be best able to answer that question. It's not an area that I worked on at a granular level. I don't know of anything within the international trade or a system that I work. So I think IT for Change might be best able to answer that. Thank you for the question. And I'm going to learn from the answer too.
Nandini, may I then just rope you in and see if you can answer that question?
Yeah, so Cressida, I think part of the problem is today that we don't have any global governance framework to rein in, let's say, the digital media corporations, right? So one of the biggest problems is the lack of that international space. Where, for instance, when we are looking at cybersecurity and when we are looking at this from a women's rights and well-being standpoint, and when you want to look at things like, making the internet safe and free from violence, there's really no place to talk about this. And that's one of the first problems that we have to solve.
All right, thank you. Sorry, just a quick thing. Kitty, would you mind maybe stop sharing your screen? Yeah, thank you so much. There is another question. Let me just check the checkbox by Gia Myers from White Plus. And she's asking, she says, I'm much inspired by all the analysis shared by our feminist role models and also many suggestions we shared on what our alternative looks like and how we get there. Would you have any small suggestion on what each can do in our daily lives by tomorrow without overwhelming our feminist engagement? Not sure who would like to answer this. Maybe Gita, may I pass this question to you?
I was hoping you wouldn't do that because I have no idea. Again, like Mariama, I think we're all just managing to live from one day to the next, and we all know all of the different things that we do or not. Let me make one suggestion. Because
Okay.
so many of us, speaking for myself particularly, are digital illiterates. Maybe one thing we can do tomorrow is to properly read the paper that's been done as the background for this. And if you've already done that, then maybe read one other thing that will inform you about the digital economy. That I think would be fitting in terms of something to do tomorrow. That's probably not what you were asking, but anyway, that's the only answer I can give you.
Thank you, Gita. And I think probably, I mean, as we're trying to discuss a new deal, or as we call it, I mean, I think it's certain that this will just not spontaneously arise, and it may just also need time. And it's probably also about resistance politics. So I think patience, but fighting at the same time would probably be also something to keep in mind. All right, I'm just checking. So it looks as if there's no further questions. So what I would like to do then is to ask all our speakers that joined us today. So Nandini, Anna, Sophia, Gita and Mariama, to have 1 minute each to just make a short closing statement. Thank you. Nandini.
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. So, what I take away from this rich conversation is that, yes, the task before us is to keep the feminist flag flying, but at the same time, we need to be attentive to what is the qualitative difference between the struggle against capitalism today from the struggle against capitalism probably in the pre-digital era, and then also need to see, like, in our mobilization and in our advocacy tactics, what can we learn from what worked and what did not work in the past, and contextually apply those historical learnings from the feminist struggle. And so there's a lot of food for thought here, as that complex and rich diagram of, the pictorial representations of the discussions show. And it was like great to have this conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Nandini. Anna?
Yes, thank you, Natalia. It's really an amazing time to be part of this conversation. I was nodding the whole time because I was listening attentively to all the questions, and it was like, yes, they all really make sense. The last question for me stood out because one thing, if anything, one thing that we were getting from the COVID-19 pandemic is that in some countries, I could mention Australia, the Philippines, for example, unions have reported that nearly every union has seen growth in membership in 2020, and they are now backed as a trusted social partner of businesses and governments. And we're seeing like the organizing activities that I mentioned earlier about organizing gig platform on demand economy, and that's for us a very optimistic development that came out of the pandemic. But we're also asking ourselves, we've been doing a lot of women's leadership organizing initiatives in the past, but then question, what can we do more? And I think we already have some answers, given the experiences that we have with targeted initiatives of building women in youth leadership in Southeast Asia. And we've seen these women and young people rising up to the challenge. So I guess the big challenge for us is to also make more feminist trade unionists among our ranks. Yeah, thank you. And read the framework once more, and probably 10 times more.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Thank you so much. Sophia.
Yes, what I wanted to say is, well, thanks a lot for all the presentations. They were really wonderful, lots of inputs. And I want to say, let's keep fighting, because the feminist movement is the one who really changed the history of humanity. We made a lot of things for the better, and we can change this. We can change this digital paradigm, and also because feminism is transversal. It's in all it's in all the society. We have seen all the political parties are talking about feminism. It doesn't matter if you're neoliberal, if you are a progressive, if you're, there's always a feminist there. And so even though they don't understand the feminism the same way we do, and we want to change the structures, we can still change things if we reach out and try to explain what our message is all about, and how do we want to empower women in this new digital era. We need to use that strength that we have, that the feminist movement is all united for some causes that are for all of us, the same causes in all over the world. That's a strength that we have. And I think that we can use that strength to change the digital economy if we really put that as an objective to reach. So I want to give hope, I want to give encouragement, and I want to say we can make this happen. We can change the world if we want, and we can start thinking about new horizons and about the world we want in the future. So that's what I wanted to leave this message. So we encourage to keep working in these issues.
Thank you, Sophia. Very encouraging indeed. Mariama?
Hi, so I accept everything that Sophia has said. I think I would like to go back to this document and the work of IT for Change, and this document and the Fed's working group on this feminist future, looking at it from the vantage point of the digital economy, which is now the new phase, partially a new phase of how we are seeing capital emerging. And just to say that this is the second panel I'm on with IT for Change and the digital discussion, and it's loaded. It's so rich. We need to unpack this, and we need to get our governments to understand it. Our governments who are negotiating here in Geneva on e-commerce, who are buying lock, stock, and barrel rules to govern the e-commerce that will lock their arms and tie their arms behind them, because the developed countries are saying, oh, it's good for women, or it's good for MSMEs. So we need to get these out, and in however popular form. We need to visit our Commerce Department to see what they're doing on this, our Trade Department. And importantly, we also need to start talking to our tax officials. The OECD discussion because of COVID, has gotten pushed to next year. But if we are not vigilant, they will be rewriting these rules, and they will be disempowering vast number of women MSME and all of us who are citizens. So I think we need to start asking questions and bringing copies of these and the other publication as simply as we can to ministries of trade, to tax department, find out who are the negotiators. And that's one level. And of course, at the level of community, we need to help people to understand how these things are impacting their day-to-day lives, whether they're cocoa farmers or flower growers or whatever, that this is not some faraway thing that is about watching TV or that is about Facebook necessarily by itself. And then, of course, the dangers of Facebook and all the other social media are something that we need to keep working on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariama. Thank you for this reminder, for call to action in a sense. Thanks. And now, last but not least, Gita.
I think one of the things that we need to do is to urgently focus on the connections between the digital economy and COVID-19. And particularly, I mean, some connections are clearly emerging. For instance, on the whole business of vaccines. It's already becoming pretty clear that the access to and rollout of vaccines may well be connected to forms of digital entry, you know, you have to have the ID card in order to be able to get vaccinated. And that is connected to, could well be connected to data surveillance. It could be connected to other mechanisms for inclusion, exclusion. So let's be, I think we urgently need to look at this, because we're sort of assuming that governments are going to prioritize vaccines distribution in a way as to make it as inclusive and fair as possible. Why should we assume that? They're the same governments that have been doing everything else in not terribly transparent, fair, or reasonable ways. And I think we really need to look at the way in which this may well play out with vaccines and with every other thing that has to do with access and control. So that's not an optimistic way of ending it, but it's a call to very urgent action that's needed, because everyone's focus right now, as we know, is just on that. What's going to happen with the COVID vaccine?
Gita, we can't hear you.
I'm done. That's because I'm not
okay,
saying
sorry,
anything.
I didn't. Okay, I thought your connection was lost. Sorry.
No,
Thank you so
no.
much.
That's all I had to say.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we're reaching the end of this session, and I'm sure these discussions can go on, or there is so much more room to continue further. On behalf of FES and also IT for Change, we would like to warmly thank our speakers for being with us here today. I think it is clear there is so much more we can continue to focus on when it comes to women's rights and in the digital economy. And I'm sure also that it's not the last you have heard from us. I would like to thank GSWF for providing us with this space, for organizing this this conference. And I have to say, though, I would like to warmly thank really IT for Change, in particular, Anita and Nandini, because you've been guiding this process. There is so much knowledge and information that you have been sharing with us. I mean, I'm learning every day. And from my end, really a warm thank you to all of you. And I do hope that we will come together in one form or another, maybe also physically, if the pandemic will allow for it at some point. I wish you all a good evening or a good day, depending on where you are. And thank you so much for joining in. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.